We are going to explore the modulation matrix. But first of all, just so that we're working with a sound that's a little bit more interesting than just a sine wave, we're going to put some of that knowledge we've gained about operators and envelopes in the last couple of videos to good use. And very quickly, we're going to create a very simple kind of electronic piano sound. So I'm going to turn on operators E and D. I'm going to route operator E into F to the value of about 47, 48, something like that. I'm going to route D into E to the value of about 26, 27. That'll do. I'm going to leave them all on sine wave and on 1 ratio. We're not going to do anything fancy there, but I'm going to turn on key sync mode, and I'm going to turn the velocity knob up on F a little bit. I'm going to turn the velocity knob up on D quite a bit, and the velocity knob on E I'm going to turn up pretty much almost all the way, so that there's a bit of kind of expression when we play with different velocities. I'm going to go on the envelopes page, and first of all I'm going to link envelope F to E and D so that I can pull out the release a little bit, and they've got that on all of them. Now I'm going to unlink just F, so D and E remain linked, and on E I'm going to pull down the sustain a little bit so that it's sustaining at a lower level, and I'm going to pull it out a bit because I want a nice long decay. Change the curve a little bit. You'll notice it's done the same thing in D. I'm now going to unlink those because I want D to be a little bit quicker. It now should sound a little bit like a Wurlitzer electronic piano. Okay, so let's jump into the modulation matrix. So running along the top here, we've got our modulation sources, and running down this right hand column here, we've got various potential destinations, things which we would like to modulate. And those are operators A through F, operator X, operator Z, and pitch. So when you route some modulation from any one of these sources into these destinations, it modulates the same thing as that operator's envelope. You with me so far? So if you route anything to A through F, it's going to be modulating the amplitude of those operators. You route anything into X, it's going to be modulating the amplitude of operator X. If you route anything into operator Z, it's going to be modulating operator Z's cutoff frequency, because of course operator Z is a filter. And if you route anything into pitch, of course it is going to affect the pitch. So you may have noticed that by default we've actually got some routing already set up. These routings are set up by default whenever you create a new sound, and they're both things that are modulating the pitch. We've got our pitch bend wheel modulating the pitch, and we've got our LFO1 modulating the pitch via the mod wheel. And the effect of these routings that are already connected, in the case of the pitch bend wheel, is that when we move that around, the pitch changes by 2 semitones either way. And you'll notice that when I move the pitch bend wheel on this bar here, you can see that MIDI input on the keyboard. And in the case of this LFO1 mod setup, it means that as we turn up the mod wheel, the amount of modulation going from LFO1 to the pitch increases. So there's a vibrato when we turn that mod wheel up. Listen. I'm going to delete that for now by double clicking on it. So let's look at our pitch bend routing over here. At the moment it's perfectly symmetrical. If you move it up, the pitch goes up by 2 semitones. If you move it down, the pitch goes down by 2 semitones. But we could change it so that when we turn the pitch bend up all the way, it goes up by 12 semitones or an octave, but we could leave it so that it still only goes down by 2 semitones when you turn it down. So there's a much wider pitch range now in the upper half of the pitch bend wheel than there is in the lower half. So FM8, it kind of almost treats pitch bend up and pitch bend down as if they're two separate MIDI controllers. I mean, if we wanted to, we could even put pitch bend up into negative values. So that goes down 3 semitones, and we could put pitch bend down into positive values. So now when I move the pitch bend wheel up, the pitch is actually going to go down, and when I move the pitch bend wheel down, the pitch is actually going to go up. But we don't even necessarily have to use the pitch bend wheel to modulate pitch. We could use it to modulate something else if we wanted to. So, for example, we could use it to modulate our carrier operator, which happens to be operator F. So if I put that on 100, the amplitude of operator F will increase as I turn the pitch bend wheel up. And we could use pitch bend down to modulate operator E, which is of course one of our modulators. It's modulating the frequency of operator F. So when the amplitude of that changes, it's going to change the amount of frequency modulation going to our carrier. So now if I move the pitch bend wheel down, it's decreasing the amount of frequency modulation because it's decreasing the amount of amplitude in operator E. And I'm not suggesting you would necessarily do stuff like this with the pitch bend wheel. I'm just trying to demonstrate how you can use these modulation sources in whatever way you want. But let's set those back to something slightly more conventional. I'm going to say pitch up 3 and pitch down -3. So what other modulation sources have we got? Well, we've got mod, which is our mod wheel. So if we wanted to use the mod wheel on our MIDI keyboard to, for example, control frequency modulation, on this patch, we would route it into operator E, because that's one of our modulators. So now our mod wheel is acting as a kind of tone control. Next to that, we've got AT and breath, and that's aftertouch and breath control. Now, aftertouch and breath control you'll find on some MIDI controllers and not on others. Breath control is what you would expect to find on MIDI wind instruments like an Akai EWI or a Yamaha WX11, something like that. Aftertouch, again, some keyboards will have it, some keyboards won't, and that's when you're holding down a note and you apply more pressure to that note. That's called aftertouch. Unfortunately, my controller keyboard doesn't have that. Next to that, we've got Control 1 and Control 2, and these are completely freely assignable to any knobs or faders on your controller keyboard. So if we go to the master page, where we've got our MIDI controller assignments down the right-hand side, I've got them set to 74 in the case of controller 1 and 71 for controller 2. That's because that's two of the knobs on my MIDI keyboard. You can double click to type in a value if you know the numbers of specific parameters on your MIDI keyboard, and those will be listed in the manual for your MIDI keyboard. Or alternatively, with one of these parameters selected, you can hit the MIDI learn button and twiddle whatever knob you want to control those parameters. So if we go back to the modulation matrix, you'll see down here, as I'm moving these knobs on my MIDI keyboard, the bars for controller 1 and controller 2 are moving. So those are just two knobs on my MIDI controller that I've chosen that I know I can route into anywhere and use them to control things like, anything like the pitch, for example. Next to controllers 1 and 2, we've got in envelope. Now that we're going to talk more about when we come to the video on routing external audio into FM8. Now the LFOs have got these kind of sub-modulation sources. And if you remember earlier, we had this LFO1 mod source routed into the pitch. Now what does that mean? Well, first of all, I'll route LFO1 directly into the pitch. And this is our LFO1 over here, so we can turn it off. We've got a rate knob. And we can change the waveform to literally any of the waveforms that are available to us on our operators. So we could have a square so that it's just straight up and down. We've got a delay which holds back the LFO for a certain amount of time. And the higher we set that to, the longer we'll have to hold the note down before we start to hear the LFO. And we've got key scale and velocity scale, which, as you can see, are already set to 50. Now, this is significant because this can kind of catch you out, because what the key scale does is vary the rate of our LFO depending on how high up the keyboard you're playing it. So lower notes, our LFO will play slower, and higher notes, the rate is faster. And velocity scale does exactly the same thing with velocity. So the harder we're hitting the notes, the faster the rate of the LFO, and the softer we're hitting the notes, the slower the rate of the LFO, like this. And when you create a new sound, as we did, these are already set to 50 by default on both LFOs. So, we could make that more extreme. But if you don't want velocity scale and key scale, if you just want to set the LFO rate where you want it and you don't want to be caught out with it playing faster or slower than you're expecting because of the velocity and the pitch you're playing it at, then you need to remember to come and turn these right down. We've got a sync button, which, if you remember, syncs it either to the tempo that you've set in the arpeggiator or to the tempo of your song if you're using NIFM8 as a plugin in your DAW. Unfortunately, on our LFOs, sync doesn't allow triplet values, which I think is a bit of a shame, but it will do even values like 16ths and 8ths and 4ths, but you have to kind of work out what they are because the numbers don't change just because you put on sync mode, so you can't actually see what resolution it is, so you just have to literally listen as you're playing it. And just like all of our operators, we can key sync it, which means that the cycle restarts every time you hit a key. And we can invert the phase. Not that we particularly need to invert the phase, because inverting the phase does exactly the same thing as dragging that down into negative values. So that's what happens if you simply route one of the LFOs into something like pitch or into an operator like that. But we can route our LFOs via these other controls, mod, aftertouch, breath, and controllers 1 and 2. And that's what we had set up at the default at the start. So if I turn this up, not LFO1, but LFO1 mod, route that into pitch, now the LFO will only affect the pitch as we turn up our mod wheel. So we can use the mod wheel as a performance tool to control the vibrato of our instrument. The parameters on LFO2 are exactly the same as those on LFO1, and just like LFO1, we can route that into things via these other controls. So for example, I could route LFO2 via controller 1 into operator E. So now our modulation is being controlled by LFO2, but only as we turn up controller 1. And don't forget, any modulation can just be double-clicked to delete it. So, this being a kind of Rhodesy, Wurlitzery electronic keyboard patch, I'm going to route LFO1 into operator F, because that's our carrier, so that's our amplitude. And I'm going to turn the rate down a bit. I'm going to turn the delay up a bit so that when we first strike a note, the amplitude is not affected. And I'm going to turn up key scale just a little bit so that it's a quicker tremolo on the higher notes. I'll turn that up a little bit. So that is how you use the modulation matrix. In the next video, we're going to take our first look at operator Z, and we're going to talk about using FM8 as a subtractive synthesizer.